Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to another episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. For today's episode, it's time to venture back into the world of Disney animated films once again. The last time I reviewed a Disney animated film was when I reviewed the Toy Story films back in episode 29. I wouldn't really count Fluffy Dogs as a Disney film, though, since that was actually made for television as opposed to being theatrically released. But anyway, enough with this yakking. Today, I'll be talking about the Rescuers films, both The Rescuers and The Rescuers Down Under. To start things off, The Rescuers was actually based off of a series of books that were written by British author Margery Sharp and illustrated by Garth Williams, who also did the illustrations for Charlotte's Web. More specifically, the first film that I'll be talking about right now actually borrows more from the second book, Miss Bianca, who is one of the main characters of both films. Anyway, The Rescuers tells the story of two mice named Bernard and Miss Bianca who are part of the Rescue Aid Society, an international group of mice stationed in New York City who make it their job to help people in trouble of any kind. The plot of the film gets kicked off when an orphan girl named Penny, who's been kidnapped, sends out a message in a bottle, which ends up getting intercepted by the mice of the Rescue Aid Society. Granted, Penny was trying to send the bottle to Morningside Orphanage, where she originally lived before she got kidnapped, but the Rescue Aid Society mice were the ones who found it first. Anyway, Bernard and Miss Bianca are picked to get some leads on what happened to Penny and try to rescue her, and after a visit to Morningside Orphanage along with some close calls, they eventually learned that Penny was taken to Devil's Bayou. So, with the help of the Albatross Orville, they fly to Devil's Bayou, where they make it their job to try and save Penny from the nefarious Madame Medusa and her bumbling sidekick Snoops. I do have to say, for being a Disney animated film that was produced during Disney's Dark Age, it's actually a very enjoyable film. I mean, yeah, it does have the usual Disney liberties like a lot of adaptations of stories or fairy tales that Disney has done in the past tend to do, but still does its best to preserve the premise of the original books that this film is based on. Several other Disney films of the past, such as Dumbo, Cinderella, and even the Aristocats, did have mice as prominent characters, but this is actually the first Disney film to actually have mice as the main protagonists, and Disney would later do the same again when creating The Great Mouse Detective less than a decade after this film was released. We also get some pretty good characters in this film as well, with Bernard being the nervous and uptight yet well-meaning straight man, and Miss Bianca being the optimistic and outgoing one who is quick to jump into the fray at the first opportunity. There's also Orville the albatross pilot, who comes across as goofy and clumsy, but still proves instrumental in helping to fly Bernard and Miss Bianca to Devil's Bayou. Rufus the cat, who helps Bernard and Miss Bianca when they're trying to find out what happened to Penny. And there's also Penny herself, who's the heartwarming orphan who just wants to have a family, but is despondent that such a thing will never happen, especially after getting kidnapped by Madame Medusa. Though speaking of which, we now get to the main villain of the film, Madame Medusa, whose goal is to obtain a rare and elusive diamond known as the Devil's Eye, which could only be found in Devil's Bayou, but has to depend on Penny to get it for her, since said diamond is in such a hard-to-reach place. Even in spite of how cruel, obsessive, and sadistic she is, Madame Medusa basically steals the show with every scene that she's in. And it especially helps that her cruelness is balanced out by her sidekick, Mr. Snoops, who tries hard in trying to be as evil as Madame Medusa, but just can't quite do it. Also, the fact that he's voiced by the late Joe Flynn of McHale's Navy really gives the character that authentically pathetic and cowardly nature. And as for the other characters, we get the swamp folks also living in Devil's Bayou, most prominently Ellie Mae and Luke, and also the most iconic of them all, Evinrude. Evinrude is the one who ends up helping take Bernard and Miss Bianca the rest of the way to where Madame Medusa and Mr. Snoops are holding Penny captive. And even though the other swamp folks don't really get much screen time in the film, they still play a big role in doing their part to help Bernard and Miss Bianca save Penny from Madame Medusa. Also, this film, like a lot of other Disney animated films, has the perfect blend of action, fun, comedy, and heart. Throughout the film, you can't help but feel sorry for Penny and all that she has to put up with after being taken away from the orphanage that she called home. But after she meets Bernard and Bianca, her faith and hope are raised up once more. It especially helps that it really follows through with the film's message that faith will help make things turn out right, no matter how bleak the situation may seem. Like a lot of other Disney animated films, this film also has a pretty good cast going for it, and the actors really do a good job with the characters that they were given. We get the late Bob Newhart as Bernard, and he was just perfect for the role, giving Bernard that appropriately nervous yet dependable atmosphere about him. There's also Eva Gabor of Green Acres' famous Miss Bianca, giving her the same outgoing and optimistic energy that she gave as Lisa Douglas from said show. The other actors also do a good job, like the late Geraldine Page as Madame Medusa, Joe Flynn as Mr. Snoops, as I mentioned earlier, etc. Another thing to point out about this film is that this is one of several Disney animated films that Don Bluth worked on back when he used to work at Disney in the 1970s, before he left the studio to make his own animation studio and create his own films, which I already talked about before in my All Dogs Go to Heaven review. Still, it's good that this film is among one of the very first Disney animated films to have some new writers and animators at the helm, especially since this was around the time that some of Disney's nine old men were either retired or dead at the time that the film was released. What's even more noteworthy is that this was actually the very last Disney film that one of the members of said group, John Lounsbury, worked on, since he actually died a year before this film was released. There's not really much more for me to talk about in regards to The Rescuers. I think it's a great film in every single way. In fact, I still have the original 1992 VHS release of it in my VHS collection. The Rescuers very unanimously gets 8 stars from me. Ta-da! And now we move on to The Rescuers Down Under, the 1990 sequel to The Rescuers. Now, this is a bit of an interesting one because this is actually the very first Disney animated sequel to have ever been produced. I mean, sure, Disney did end up making sequels to several live action films, like Son of Flubber to The Absent Minded Professor, The Shaggy DA to The Shaggy Dog, and even the Herbie films and The Apple Dumpling Gang Rides Again and Return to Witch Mountain. But no one had ever thought to make a sequel to a Disney animated film in the history of animation. In fact, ideas for a sequel to The Rescuers started as far back as 1984, when Michael Eisner, who was newly established as the CEO of Disney, had begun spitballing ideas for a sequel to The Rescuers. Originally, the sequel would have focused on Penny's life with her new family in New York City after she was finally adopted at the end of the first film. However, the producers ended up scrapping that idea because they didn't think that the plot was convincing enough, so they ended up starting over. Though the idea of the setting being New York City would be used in Oliver and Company, and Penny would end up getting replaced by another similarly named girl named Jenny. It's because of this that we ended up getting the film that we're more familiar with, which is The Rescuers Down Under, mainly because of the success of Crocodile Dundee as a way of exposing American audiences to Australian culture. I mean, sure, other Australian films at the time, such as The Man from Snowy River, as well as its sequel, The Man from Snowy River 2, or known to Americans as Return to Snowy River, were brought over to America, but they ended up becoming rather obscure pretty fast. In fact, now that I mention it, it might not be a bad idea to do a review of The Man from Snowy River and its sequel sometime in the future. Food for thought. Anyway, what's The Rescuers Down Under about? Well, in Australia, there's a young boy named Cody who makes a living helping Australian animals that are in trouble with the help of some other Australian animals. When he hears that the latest animal that's been caught is a rare golden eagle by the name of Marahute, Cody manages to free her after some difficulty, and as a reward is taken by the bird to see her eggs. However, at the same time, Cody ends up running afoul of the nefarious McLeach, a poacher who's been searching for Marahute with the intention of catching her for money. And of course, when McLeach finds out that Cody actually knows about Marahute, he captures him in the hopes that Cody could tell him where the eagle can be found. Fortunately, just like in the previous film, the Rescue Aid Society end up getting wind of what happened once word about it has spread worldwide. And also, just like in the previous film, Bernard and Bianca are once again called upon to travel to Australia in order to find and rescue Cody. Also, like in the previous film, Bernard and Bianca need transportation to get to Australia, so they end up recruiting Wilbur, the brother of Orville the Albatross, who takes them most of the way to Australia. This film is especially unique that, aside from being Disney's first animated sequel, this is the very first Disney animated film that decided to break tradition and veer away from the animated musical genre, instead becoming a full-on action-adventure film. Yes, the first film did have some songs to try and fit in with the Disney animated canon, but this film completely eschews having actual songs in favor of trying to go for a different approach in regards to telling a convincing story. Though to be fair, The Black Cauldron didn't have any actual songs either, but at least it still fit the fantasy fairy tale aspect of the Disney animated canon, despite bombing hard at the box office. And as for this film itself, it actually pales in comparison to that of the first Rescuers film. I remember liking this film a lot as a kid, even getting the original VHS of it for Christmas, which I still have to this day. However, now that I'm older, after reading some reviews and learning about the history of what went on with this film, it's very clear that this film actually has quite a few problems. Although it's great to see Bernard and Miss Bianca once again, they don't really get as much of the spotlight as they did in the first film. The first half of the film focusing entirely on Cody and his bond with Marahute up until he got kidnapped by McLeach. But anyway, speaking of Bernard and Miss Bianca, Bob Newhart and Eva Gabor actually reprised their roles as both characters from the first film, which is actually a nice touch. And we also get some new characters in the film, like Cody, Marahute, and McLeach, as I mentioned before. But we also get Jake, who helps Bernard and Bianca look for Cody once they arrive in Australia. Joanna, who serves as McLeach's right-hand pet and who is obsessed with eating eggs, especially wanting to eat Marahute's eggs. And of course, there's also Wilbur, the albatross pilot, who assists in taking Bernard and Bianca to Australia. Though he does end up getting put through the ringer, especially near the end of the film, which I'll talk about later. Plus, the actors that got to voice the characters actually did a good job with what they were giving, like the late George C. Scott as McLeach, and especially the late John Candy as Wilbur, as I mentioned before in my Camp Candy review. There's also a bunch of other new characters as well, but they don't really play as big a role in the film as the main characters do, and there's actually a reason for that, which I'll get to in a bit. Despite the fact that this film is actually the second film released during the Disney Renaissance following The Little Mermaid, it didn't do as well at the box office, unlike The Little Mermaid did, or even the rest of the films in the Disney Renaissance that came to follow in the wake of this film and the latter. Though it probably has to do with the fact that it was released on the same weekend as that of Home Alone and Rocky V. The same thing also happened to All Dogs Go to Heaven when it was released the same weekend as that of The Little Mermaid, which I talked about already in my All Dogs Go to Heaven review. If you really want to know my thoughts on that movie, then go check out the review for yourselves. Another reason that this film bombed at the box office was because audiences that were more used to the animated musical genre of Disney were a bit disappointed that the film had a complete lack of songs, with too much emphasis being put on the action-adventure genre. But this would not be the last Disney animated film to receive a lot of flack for not being an animated musical. The same thing would later happen to 2001's Atlantis the Lost Empire and especially 2022's Strange World, with both films also being animated action-adventure films that would also become box office bombs due to not actually fitting in with the Disney quota. Now we get to another big reason why the film was a box office bomb. A lot of questions were left unanswered in the film, such as what happened to the animals that helped Cody at the beginning of the film? Did Cody ever get to reunite with his mother at the end, even after she believed that Cody was killed? What happened to the animals that were held captive in McLeach's lair? And especially, why didn't anyone think to return for Wilbur after Bernard tasked him to look after Marahute's eggs? I mean, sure, Cody was under the impression that Marahute's eggs ended up eaten by Joanna, but the audience knows that Bernard was able to hide the eggs from Joanna before she could do so. So Bernard could have at least let Cody know that Marahute's eggs were safe and sound, and that he and Marahute had nothing to worry about. But the way the film came together just seemed a bit too jumbled and was left with too many loose ends to tie up. I can't seem to find any information on why the animators and producers did it like this, other than the possibility that they were having to rush the film in order to try and meet their deadline. It also didn't help matters that because the film had to compete against Home Alone, Jeffrey Katzenberg, one of the former heads of Disney before he left to become one of the founders for DreamWorks, ended up having to put an end to the film's promotional campaign once it became clear that the film's opening box office weekend didn't turn out the way Disney hoped it would. It's rather unfortunate that this film ended up the way it did, along with not doing too well at the box office, because there were supposed to be plans for a third Rescuers film to have been released in 1996, but the film's poor box office reception, combined with the death of Eva Gabor a year prior to that, being that this was actually Eva Gabor's final film, ended up putting the kibosh on that idea for good. If they would have made a third Rescuers film, who knows if it would have picked up where this film left off, or if it would have had Bernard and Bianca on a brand new rescue mission after getting married, which is another thing that I should talk about. Throughout the film, there's a subplot where Bernard is trying to ask Bianca for her hand in marriage, but a lot of different circumstances and misunderstandings keep him from doing so. On one hand, it is pretty amusing to see Bernard have to go through one situation after the other to try and propose to Bianca, but on the other hand, it can get rather old pretty fast to see Bernard get thwarted in his attempts to ask Bianca to marry him, not helped by the fact that Jake kept pushing Bernard aside and kept appealing himself to Bianca. Then again, the first film did establish Bernard as being nervous and uptight with a tendency to stutter, which is still kept intact in this film, up until near the climax, where Bernard actually ended up having the nerve to take on a Razorback to take him to where McLeach has Cody and the others held captive. And at the end, where Bernard finally proposes to Bianca and she accepts, you can't help but feel happy for Bernard for finally overcoming his insecurity after what happened. But even in spite of this, all those other plot points of the film have been left unresolved, and not one of the characters even had a second thought to go and rescue the animals in McLeach's lair, or even return for Marahute's eggs once Bernard left them in Wilbur's care. I admit that I didn't really give a second thought to all those unanswered questions as a kid, but now that I'm older, it now bothers me that the producers didn't come up with a proper conclusion to the film that would answer those questions. I mean, it's an okay film, but like I said before, it really pales in comparison to that of the first film. After all that I said thusly, I think my mind is made up. The Rescuers Down Under very clearly get 7.5 stars. This film could have been done better. It really could have had a chance to answer all of the questions that were left unanswered and had all those loose ends tied up that really had audiences guessing and on the edge of their seats. And if the producers and executives would have put in a few songs to show the audience that the film still fits in with the Disney animated canon, then audiences would have given it a slightly better reception. Instead, the higher ups at Disney had to rush the film that they just didn't have enough time to actually find a way to wrap up the story that was unfolding before them. Such a sad way to go when it comes to filmmaking. But despite this, I will admit that both The Rescuers and The Rescuers Down Under are two of my favorite Disney films that I will still watch when I'm in the mood. There's also been some debate on which film is the best, some people preferring the first film due to its more cohesive storytelling and much more appealing plot, despite having been released during Disney's Dark Age, while other people prefer the second film due to the more fast-paced action and the change of scenery with the plot taking place in Australia. Even then, you can't really deny that The Rescuers Down Under wasn't able to make its mark with a lot of people when it was first released, compared to that of The Rescuers. But then again, The Rescuers didn't really do so good either, even when it was reissued to theaters a year before The Rescuers Down Under was released, which makes the whole thing rather retroactive in some cases. Maybe that was foreshadowing to the second film's poor box office release, who knows? Well, anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. Just like before, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the notification bell for more episodes or whatever video that might come your way. So until next time, see you in the future!